Dr. Lose, thank you very much for your very insightful typology. Also striving the points of procedures regarding the length of the process and the economic outcome. That the interest of what has been paid was always much higher than the value of the business itself. And also thank you very much for also pointing out the, let's say, ideas of the credibility of victims, the point of credibility of victims, and the burden of proof, as well as the fact that the research is pretty difficult. And you mentioned the renaming of the businesses, for example, that really makes the burden much harder to go into more and more accurate research. In the next lecture, we'll focus more on the macro level. Rachel Blumenthal will compare how Germany and Austria dealt with their past. Rachel Blumenthal is a fellow of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry in the Hebrew University. She researches the cataclysmic consequences of the Second World War. She was awarded a PhD degree by the Hebrew University for her thesis on the Claims Conference, the State of Israel and the Diaspora from 1951 to 1964, and holds an LLM from Tel Aviv University. In August 2021, Lexington Books published her book Right to Reparations, the Claims Conference and the Holocaust Survivors from 1951 to 1964. The Leo Baeck Institute in New York awarded her the Westheimer Fellowship in 2022, and she is now researching on Austrian model of restorative justice. Relating to your provocative title, All the Austrians Went Away with Murder, I look forward to the different levels your lecture will touch, and please come up to the stage.
Voilà. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much to Professor Stauber for organizing the conference and to the committee for inviting me to talk. Thank you very much to Adi and Sarah for organizing everything. And thank you to the sponsors, of course, especially the Claims Conference. Okay. I wanted to say at the beginning something about this building, because this building is now called the Museum of the Jewish People, but it was originally the Museum of the Jewish Diaspora. It was envisaged by Nachum Goldman. Nachum Goldman thought it was very important to teach Israelis about the diaspora, and the Claims Conference funded the building, and so it's very appropriate that we have this conference in this building. And now to my subject about Austria. So, annexed Austria and Austrians played the same role as Germany and Germans in the robbery and murder of Jews in the Second World War. Pictures like this, I don't think you have anything similar in Germany. The violence in Austria was far greater than in Germany. Okay. Okay. So Vienna was the, Austrians were 10% of the entire population of Greater Germany, but they filled almost 10%, almost half the senior positions in the Holocaust command structure. And there were lawyers. It's important for those of us who are lawyers to remember that lawyers do terrible things. So there was Seitz Inquart and Otto Wächter, who were lawyers and took a very active part in the Holocaust. Vienna, before the Second World War, there were 200,000 Jews, mainly in Vienna. Vienna was one of the first cities that was declared Judenrein. Adolf Eichmann set up his central office for Jewish emigration on August the 26th, 1938, and within a year, 126,445 Jews had emigrated after being stripped of their citizenship and all their property. In the years 1941 to 1944, 65,000 Jews were deported to the east, very few returned, and only 6,000 members of the original community remained in Austria during the war. This is 3%. So Jewish demands for restitution did not distinguish between Jews from Austria or Jews from Germany. The basis was the persecution, not the country of origin. So in one of the first demands, which was, I'm sure we all know, drafted by Shalom Adler-Udel, who was the director of the Central British Fund for German Jews, which is now the World Jewish Relief. He talked about the basis of the claim being property that had been stolen from Jews both in Germany and in Austria. But in practice, there was a huge difference. And in this talk, I want to explain why I think this difference occurred, and I want to put forward 5 separate explanations. So the first explanation was the German refusal to pay compensation to Austrian victims. Protocol 1 to the Luxembourg Agreement laid down the ground rules on compensation for Hitler's victims. Its provisions were the basis for the federal law on compensation of victims of National Socialist persecution, the BEG. Under the BEG, survivors who belong, we've heard about this, who belong to the German field of culture, language and culture, were eligible to benefits under the law. But this did not apply to Austrian Jews. Austrian Jews did speak German. Many of them were part of this Schiller and Goethe, but they were excluded from the law. The Claims Conference went back to the Germans and said, this is not acceptable. And the Germans said, the Austrian Jews should go to their own government. We're not going to pay anything to Austrian Jews. So this is one explanation. The second explanation is the question of who were the true victims. So in Germany, you have a transition from the Weimar Republic to the National Socialist regime, which was very quick and complete. The Weimar Republic existed for 15 years. On January the 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor, and then in March, Hitler passes the Ermächtigungsgesetz, the enablement law, and that's the end of democracy and the beginning of the Third Reich. So the result is that victims are people persecuted by the National Socialists. This is clear to everyone. When you're talking about victims, you know that there are people who were persecuted by the National Socialists. And it's true that for a long time, many groups were excluded from the BEG, from any form of compensation, but still there is this understanding that victims are victims of National Socialism. In Austria, things were much more complicated. So in Austria, there was a sort of very gradual transition from democracy to National Socialism. You have at the beginning the rump state, which emerged from the First World War and the Treaty of Saint-Germain with the constitution by Hans Kelsen. And in 1933, you have Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, who comes to power, and Dollfuss is not a Democrat. He dissolves the parliament, and he replaces it with a fascist regime. This is Austro-fascism, and he chases after the communists, but he doesn't want to annex Austria to Germany because he needs loans in order to finance the Austrian state. And so in the following year, you have National Socialists who assassinate Dollfuss, and he's replaced by Schuschnigg, and Schuschnigg executes some of the National Socialists who he executes who had assassinated Dollfuss, and then you have, in 1938, of course, you have the Anschluss. So at the end of the war, you have 3 separate groups claiming that they were the true victims. You have the communists who were persecuted by Dollfuss. You have the National Socialists who were persecuted by Schuschnigg, and then you have the Jews who were persecuted by everyone. This is reflected in the Austrian social security laws. So Austria passes laws very quickly at the end of the war. You have the Victims' Welfare Act, which is called the Opferfürsorgegesetz, which was enacted in July 1945, and it provided food, clothing, pensions, and assistance in finding work to victims of fascism. But this category was limited to resistance fighters and individuals who had been persecuted on political grounds. Of course, this excluded Jews because they were deemed to be persecuted on racial grounds. In 1947, the Victims' Welfare Act was revised, and now it was extended to victims of racial and religious persecution. In theory, Jews should have been now entitled to victim indemnification papers, financial assistance with a small annual tax credit, but not to a pension. But in practice, this didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because a prerequisite was that you had to have Austrian citizenship, and all the Jews lost their citizenship before the war, and it was not restored after the war. So the result was that only a tiny minority of Jews who chose to remain or resettle in Austria were entitled to social benefits. In the words of Elizabeth Anthony, who has written a recent book about the return of Jews to Vienna after the war, Austrian Jews could be victims as Austrians, but not as Jews. And so now I move on to the third explanation, and this is about restitution. According to Gestapo records, the value of Aryanized property in Austria was $1.2 billion, and this estimation was certainly too low. Restitution took a very different path in West Germany and in Austria. And the reason for this, I'm going to put forward 3 points. One, the different legal definition of the status of West Germany and Germany and Austria. Two, the activities of the Jewish organizations in the two different countries. And three, the location of Jewish assets in Austria and in Germany. So at the beginning, you have the definition of Austria as liberated, not occupied. And this was a serious obstacle to Jewish attempts to obtain redress for Jewish losses. The basis, of course, we all know, was the Moscow Declaration from 1943, which mistakenly stated that Austria was the first free country to fall victim to Hitlerite aggression. And as a result, the Soviet occupying power allowed Karl Renner, a social democrat, to set up a provisional state government in Vienna on April the 27th, 1945. So this is before the end of the war. And subsequently, he was appointed by the State Council to be the president, and you have elections. And so Austria has this legitimacy in the eyes of the Allied and a large degree of autonomy. And the result was that Austria laid down the ground rules on restitution. And of course, this contrasts with Germany, where the occupying forces, they were the ones who laid down the rules, because Germany was occupied, it wasn't liberated. Jewish organizations such as the Joint and the World Jewish Congress were very active in Germany, in occupied Germany at the end of the war. They lobbied the occupiers for restitution, and as a result, the US military government, and someone has mentioned this already, passed the law number 59 on November the 10th, 1947, and the purpose was to effect, to the largest extent possible, the speedy restitution of identifiable property to persons wrongly deprived of it in the years 1933 to 1945. And moreover, this law established the concept of a successor organization. Again, this was thanks to the Jewish lobbying. And the idea was that if you have property that had been Aryanized and the owners had been murdered and there were no heirs, the successor organization would step into the shoes of the original owners and they would claim and receive the property. And what they then did was that they sold it and divided it up between the Joint and Israel. In Austria, the Jewish organizations were much less active, and the result was there was no parallel Law 59, and there was no recognition in Austria of a successor organization. And a third important impediment to restitution was the Soviet control of Vienna. So most Jewish property in Austria was located in Vienna. And of course, the Russians, the Soviets, were not very keen on restoring property to private owners. According to Robert Knight, for the communists, the seizure and nationalization of Reich German capital was of more importance than the restoration of Jewish property. In other zones of Austria, which were controlled by the Western powers, there was very little Jewish property. It wasn't like in Germany where the property was spread, the communities were spread all over Germany and the assets were spread all over Germany. So the result was that if you have all the property in one place and that one place is under Soviet control, it's very difficult to obtain restitution. And now to my next point about the parties to the negotiation. So we all know that the Luxembourg Treaty was negotiated by three parties. You have Israel, you have the Claims Conference, and you have West Germany. But in Austria, it was the question of who represents the Jews was very problematic. Israel did not take part in the negotiations. At the top, there's a newspaper clipping, which there was no actual decision of the former Israeli Foreign Ministry, we are not going to take part, but Israel decided that they were not going to have any claims against Austria. And this clearly weakened the Jewish claim. The result was that instead of a state, you have only an organization. You have the Claims Conference, which is now renamed itself to call itself the Committee of Jewish Claims on Austria in New York, together with the Federation of Jewish Communities in Austria, and they established the Joint Executive Board for Jewish Claims on Austria. They like these very long names, and they presented themselves as the spokesman at the talks. But the Austrians didn't recognize them. So at the beginning, you have Dr. Klein of the Finance Ministry, who said that he was willing to hear the Jewish delegation, but he was not willing to negotiate with them as an equal partner. And so this refusal reflects the way that Austrians dealt, the problematic way that they dealt with their past. And another important difference is the attitude of the politicians. So Adenauer believed strongly in the need for reaching a settlement. And he initiated, after he was prompted by Goldman and by Israel, he initiated the negotiations. And when the negotiations broke down and Goldman went to Rundorf and persuaded him to resume the negotiations, Adenauer overruled his financial people, Schäfer and Abs, and he persuaded them, he insisted that they reach an agreement. In Austria, the leaders continued to make openly anti-Semitic statements after the war. So Karl Renner set the tone when in a cabinet meeting held on May the 10th, this is 2 days after the end of the war, 1945, on what they call Aryanizing inverted commas in the original, he said that a law would be passed on restitution, but added compensation of every little Jewish merchant or peddler for his loss was inconceivable. In August, Renner informed the cabinet that we were punished enough, we bear no responsibility. And later, Minister of Finance, Dr. Reinhard Keimetz, member of the SPÖ, the Socialist Party, explained that payment of any kind of restitution was out of the question because Austria did not cause any damage and therefore was not obliged to pay any kind of reparation. So you have this very legalistic, formal argument. There's no Austria, so Austria is not obliged to pay any compensation. Leopold Fiegel, who replaced Renner as Chancellor, argued that only a small number of Austrian Jews were murdered. In his words, the biggest Juden massacre only began in 1942, and by then our Jews were gone. miraculously, usually with some luggage, a ship's ticket and 200 Reichsmark. So this is very important to notice the difference between the politicians' attitude in Germany and Austria. And now to my last point, which is about the tactics. So my argument is that there were the Austrian procrastination, and Austria argued that it was too poor to pay compensation, and these were important factors in the outcome. So negotiations started. In Germany, you have negotiations which start in March and end in September. This is 6 months, and you reach a more or less some sort of settlement. In Austria, negotiations start in the following year, in July 1953, and they continually break down. They start again. They break down, and as I said, the Austrians didn't really want to talk to the Jews, and in the end, it's the Allies behind the scenes who put pressure on the Austrians to provide some sort of solution. And so in 1956, the Austrians reached a partial settlement, and in 1961, they reach another settlement. So negotiations lasted from 1953 to 1961. This is 8 years, and as a lawyer, you know that the longer the negotiations, usually the worse the outcome. And this was definitely the case in the case of Austria. And at the outset, Julius Raab, who was the chancellor at the time, talked about the difficult financial and political situation of Austria. Austria, not the Jews, was to be pitied. And now to the outcome. So a memo of the Council of Jews from Austria and Israel dated August 1961 stated, "Keiner von uns ist mit dem Erreichten zufrieden." None of us are happy with the results. On January 1956, you have it, this is in Hebrew and German. So in January 1956, the Austrians set up one fund. It was 550 million shillings, which was approximately $22 million. It was a help fund. It wasn't reparations. And a small percentage of the victims, mainly people over the age of 60, received sums of between $800 to $1,200. This is one-time payments. That's all they received. And then Austria set up a second fund with this very long, complicated name. This time they had $6 million. They set aside $6 million. So the total sum was $28 million. And I mean, this is incomparable to the sums that Germany paid. On restitution, Austria settled claims for 4,000 properties for a sum of 83 million shillings, 80% to Glaubensjuden. But most of the properties that were returned were in a very dilapidated condition. And what the few people who managed to get their properties back, what they did, and there are books about this, Frusci and Rothschild, they sold them for pennies. And you have these beautiful buildings now in Vienna, which a lot of them have been restored, but they had belonged to the Jews, and the government acquired them for pennies. And as to other assets, almost nothing was returned. I was in Vienna in the summer, and I walked past, there's a pharmacy, an apotheker. My grandmother was a pharmacist, and it says she has this description where she talks about the fact that her pharmacy was arisiert and then was restored. So it's still very much alive in Austria. On the other hand, you have this picture from the Klimt. There's a frieze, and in 2015, the Austrians, it had belonged to Jews. It was plundered. It was acquired by the Austrians in the 1950s, and then the Jewish owners applied to have it restored, and the government said they didn't think it was appropriate. So now to my conclusion. So a Jew from Vienna and a Jew from Berlin who underwent the same nightmare during the Third Reich: expropriation of property, loss of citizenship, incarceration, starvation, and forced labor, were entitled to very different remedies. And the Austrian model of justice compared unfavorably to the tripartite Luxembourg Agreement. And the title of my talk is not something I invented. I took it from Maurice Bruckstein, who was the legal counsel to the Claims Conference, and he talked about the Austrians getting away with murder, which I like because it has a double meaning. And so a comparison between Germany and Austria highlights very different treatment. In West Germany, restitution was the rule. In Austria, the exception. And the government refused to recognize the rights of Jewish organizations to heirless property. In Austria, compensation was presented as charity. Professor Goschler's talked about charity. It was always charity in Austria, not justice. And only the neediest received very small sums from the help funds. Research, and so Austria was not the only country that behaved in this way. I mean, there were lots of countries who profited from the Nazi regime, the Nazi era, and for instance, Holland, and people who plundered property in Holland, again, remained the owners at the expense of the original Jewish owners. And so that is why I think it's very important to analyze each country, each place separately. Like the Holocaust didn't happen, it wasn't one single event, it was lots and lots of single, separate events. The restitution and compensation, again, was lots and lots of different cases, and it's very important to research them. So thank you very much.